co-founder of the Robert H. Jackson Center, so have more than a casual interest in subjects of that, and noted with great interest your law review article on transformative justice and the ethos of Nuremberg, and going so far as to allowing us how that the Nuremberg trial was perhaps one of the greatest trials in at least the past century or so. Why did you choose the subject? What generated or caused you to kind of take on it?
You know, a couple of things. One was that I was looking at trials at that point academically. I also had a colleague, Tom Bergenthal, who I loved a great deal, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. In fact, he was the last child to leave Auschwitz. And his story is also discussed in that law review article. But in looking, I was trying to understand the role of trials in society. Trials have a social dialogic role that they resonate with the American people, whether it's the Limburg trial or the Simpson trial or something like Nuremberg. They have this dialogic and transformative role. They change people's views. Limburg was enormously important, as was the Scopes trial. People began to understand more about the legal system. So the same is true with Simpson. Many people learned a great deal from the Simpson trial as to how the law works. And I wanted to understand a little further of why trials hold this transformative role. And it also goes into the role of the jury and how jurors change. You know, one of the things I mentioned is that originally, when we were struggling to figure out the core question of guilt, we started in the most primitive way, trying to get God to tell us who was guilty and who was not. And that led to trials by ordeal, which eventually were eliminated. But the great advance in civil liberties in eliminating trial by ordeal was torture. So the idea was that since God's not going to tell us, there's only one person that can really tell us, and that's you. And so they would torture you, believing that an innocent man, even tortured, would never accuse himself or confess something he didn't do. But one of the things I noted is that even among the trials by ordeal, and then later in the torture cases, jurors played a very important role. There was one ordeal called the ordeal of the poisoned bread. And so the entire village would gather around, and you'd be given this poisoned bread. And a man would stand there and hold the antidote. And then everyone in the village would clap 500 times. And if you were still standing by 500 claps, they'd give you the antidote. And in some ways, it may have been the first jury system, because you can imagine if the jury thought you were innocent, those claps would come a lot faster than if they thought you were guilty. It really was to convey, both the trials by ordeal, later torture, that guilt was beyond question, because back then you had to accept it. Now, many times judges would ride circuit. You wouldn't see a judge for a year, maybe even 2 years. So when that judge left that village, that village had to believe that justice was done. Otherwise, you'd have more killings. In many ways, we try to achieve the same thing today, even though we use scientific proof. Nuremberg was perhaps the most important in that sense, and we were very fortunate to have Jackson as one of the prosecutors. They understood, particularly Jackson understood, that he was not just trying to prove the guilt of the defendants. He was putting on trial the genocide of the Nazis. He knew that there would be deniers. He knew that there were people that still would not accept the result. And he knew that this trial was going to be watched, particularly by Germans. And it did have a transformative effect, including on Germans. Jackson was an interesting character in that way. You know, one of the complaints against how we select our justices is that we often have justices with very little legal experience. And that can come out. You know, it can come out during oral arguments. Some of the justices will say things and we'll look at each other like, oh, for the love of Mike, you've never been in a courtroom. If you had, you would never said what you just said. But They come with different skills, but many of them have not practiced. Jackson walked the walk. He was a highly educated person that actually had one of the broadest resumes. He had practice, he had government service, of course. All of that gave him a certain depth to his service on the court. He was also in many ways, it made him particularly practical. Mm-hmm. That is, his famous quote about the Constitution not being a suicide pact is a quote that I've actually criticized because it's often used by people to limit civil liberties. But that's not what Jackson intended, and it's sort of like Oliver Wendell Holmes with yelling "fire in a crowded theater." Holmes himself walked away from that because people were misusing it. They were using it as a way to say that therefore we can just limit speech anytime we darn well need to or want to. Jackson didn't intend his line to be this invitation for compromise on every issue. But he was very practical. And it's interesting because Jackson, of course, had Rehnquist as his clerk. Then Rehnquist had Roberts as his clerk. And so there's this wonderful legacy of chiefs. But in some ways, Roberts comes closest to Jackson, because Roberts has that same very practical streak. He wants to find ways where the court's credibility will not be lost. He doesn't like the court getting ahead of its skis. He likes to have states and the political system make decisions, not the courts. Those were all very Jacksonian things. Jackson didn't like the court playing that role either.
Part of what's in the forefront today is the Youngstown's the steel seizure case and the presidential powers, implied presidential powers, the use of the executive orders. Do you see, and I know you've written about his three-part formula. Is that relevant today?
It is, I think, Jackson's most lasting legacy. There are very few doctrines that have been reinforced to the extent as Youngstown. And indeed, in many ways, Jackson has been mimicked in other opinions. His tripartite test is still used, is still respected. And it was interesting that when the court dealt with presidential immunity, it was a very Jacksonian opinion. They broke up presidential immunity cases into three, and they were very Jacksonian in terms of when something is a core presidential function, when it's a personal function. It was sort of Youngstown on immunity. And in some ways, Jackson may have influenced the court not just in doctrine, but in methodology, in that sense. But it was also quintessentially Jackson, because he looked at this very difficult issue of presidential seizure of steel mills and presidential power, and he cut through it to look for that middle point that, the Constitution to him was a balancing of values. There were no absolute rights. And it was a document written by very practical people. In my book, I talk about how the framers, particularly Madison, wanted to create a system that could withstand the pressures of a democratic process. So Rage in the Republic compares the American Revolution to the French Revolution. And Madison famously said that if every Athenian was a Socrates, every assembly would still be a mob. And what he was saying is that Athens was destined to fail, as it did. Athens, the democracy didn't last very long. It became a tyranny. And the reason is that the system itself couldn't handle the pressures that it generated. And Madison and the rest knew that. Benjamin Rush said, we can't have democracy if it becomes a mobocracy. And so these individuals created a very practical document that would force compromise, would divide powers, And Madison and also Montesquieu and other key writers said if you want to create a system, you first understand human beings. Madison really understood human beings. And in the Rage of the Republic, I compare Madison to Paine. And it's a very interesting comparison. I spent a lot of time talking about Paine. He's a fascinating character. Even though I'm a Madisonian scholar, he's an inexhaustibly interesting historical character.
Thomas Paine.
Yes, the funny thing is that Thomas Paine, I think, fashioned himself, and in some ways this was legitimate, as being closer to the people than Madison and others. And that was certainly true. But in a curious way, Madison understood people better than Paine. Paine did not want those auxiliary precautions, those divisions of power. He wanted more direct democracy. He wanted a unicameral legislative system. Madison was against that. But the reason I spend a lot of time on Thomas Paine in Rage of the Republic is he was one of two figures that played a role in both the American and French revolutions. And when he went to France, he saw what happens if you have more direct democracy, if you don't have those Madisonian protections. And it damn near came to close to killing him. Mm-hmm. He was within hours of being guillotined at one point. And to Thomas Paine's credit, he came to acknowledge that Madison was right in many respects. Jackson really understood that. Understood that this sort of practical balance that comes out of the U.S. Constitution. And in that sense, I think people are often wrong about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You know, scholars often dismiss the Declaration of Independence. I don't. Rage in the Republic is largely about the Declaration of Independence. What the Constitution was Madison's system to guarantee what was promised in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was an Enlightenment document. We were the first major Enlightenment revolution, but it was Lockean from top to bottom. It was this product of the Enlightenment. The Constitution was Madison's way of achieving that, but he understood to achieve it, you had to understand the flaws of human beings. You had to understand factions and the divisions of human beings. He understood that better than Thomas Paine. Jackson also understood that. You know, he viewed our system as this powerful engine of democratic choice that is funneled into this framing that Madison created, that pushes for compromise. This was a document that talks about sweeping human rights, but nothing is treated as an absolute. And that really is probably, if you look at Jacksonian philosophy, that's what comes out of it. In many ways, Youngstown reflects that.
So this is the ultimate. So when you type in Jonathan Turley and Robert H. Jackson, you know, your good friend AI Mode says, more broadly, Turley often invokes historical precedents like Nuremberg to caution against, quote, governmental rage, end of quote, and the criminalization of political speech, arguing that the law must remain a neutral arbiter even during times of intense social conflict. Did AI get it right?
Strangely, it did get it right. I guess a blind squirrel will find a nut at some point, but no, that does get it right. And Nuremberg really does represent the best of us, and so did Jackson represent the best of us. Nuremberg was a moment where a trial focused a world on a horizon that we were still trying to reach. That's what Jackson was trying to do. You know, trials often talk about standards that few of us really satisfy. You know, when we talk about a reasonable person, most of us are not reasonable. Most of us do things that are unlawful or unreasonable or uncivil. In many ways, the law focuses us on a horizon that we want to reach as a society. Nuremberg was like that. Nuremberg was talking about who we can be by showing who we have been. And Jackson put in front of the world this horrendous view of the brutality of humanity. And one of the things I talk about in Rage in the Republic is that there was an influential writer in the French Revolution who remarked that revolution is like Saturn, it devours its children. Certainly Thomas Paine saw that in France. But I talk in the book about this Saturn's gene that we know we all have. It's the ability of human beings to become monsters. What Jackson was describing in Nuremberg was how humanity became the victim of monsters. And this gets to the whole expression of the banality of evil when you look at people like Eichmann and others, that these monsters were not some, movie villain. They were these often very weak people, like Eichmann, who unleashed the worst parts of humanity on itself. Jackson was able to capture that in Nuremberg, and he didn't spare anyone. If you look at how Nuremberg was done, Jackson just stripped it away. He wanted people to see the films, not talk about them, see the piles of corpses for what really happened.